humble audience. I need to check. Hold on just one second. Brian Cates is over here texting me stuff. It's a post about something General Flynn posted. I'll have to look at that later. All right, so Chapter 12, Morgenthau's Plan. Okay, let's dig into this. We're back to talking, of course, about Herbert Pell, the guy that was designated to be FDR's representative to the War Crimes Committee that everyone in the State Department's trying to sabotage. But obviously, he has a lot in common with the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., because they saw it a lot alike. So, Pell and Morgenthau Jr. insisted upon clarifying the calculated ambiguities, I got a hiccup, sorry, on war crimes policy with the State Department, and the State Department's bureaucrats fought back viciously. They pursued their own policies as FDR's health continued to deteriorate. By the summer of 44, there were three main centers within the U.S. government engaged in this thought process. Two of the three were dominated by advocates within the State Department. The first of these was a thing called the European Advisory Commission, which basically was an inter-allied consultative committee created to work out the details of decisions reached by the Big Three at the summit in Tehran in November of 1943. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had agreed in principle on several key aspects of military strategy in Europe, a plan for the post-war UN organization, and general outlines of policies on war crimes and denazification. Though many of the details remained to be resolved, the three allies agreed that they would eventually separate Prussia from Germany, that there would be some form of isolation or international control of the German military-industrial complex, and that Nazis would be permanently barred from any position of responsibility in post-war Germany. That's basically what they agreed upon. Stalin and Churchill disagreed on the location of several borders in the aftermath of World War II. Those questions were referred to a new European Advisory Commission for study. All of the U.S. representatives to the new commission, George Kennan, Philip Mosley, and E.F. Penrose, were openly hostile to any accommodations with the Soviet on post-war policy towards Germany. Instead, they used the EAC to promote a strategy calculated to rapidly establish a post-Hitler Germany as an economic, political, and eventually a military backstop to the Soviet Union. The Soviets could see the drift at the EAC and soon decided to remain aloof from the post-war planning process because they could see the writing on the wall. The second main planning committee was a politically similar group with overlapping personnel organized at the State Department and headquartered in Washington. This group and the U.S. delegation to the EAC each pushed for a stern peace with reconciliation, as the slogan went. They favored rapid elimination of Allied controls on German economy, maintenance of German industrial production at something close to its wartime levels, though without arms production, and sharp limitations on any prosecution of war crimes. So in other words, we had two committees, one that the Allies are part of with the overlapping membership of one in Washington that's opposed to anything that was laid out at the first one. This ran counter to what Roosevelt had personally promised to both Stalin and Churchill. But you can trace them both to Roosevelt himself. By 1944, FDR had grown so suspicious of the Foreign Service that he withheld even his own Secretary of State from details of his international commitments, including those reached at Tehran, although the State Department had other sources of information. The third center for post-war planning consisted of civil affairs specialists on the staffs of the War Department and SHAPE, which was the Supreme Headquarter Allied Expeditionary Forces, who was under the command of Dwight D. Eisenhower. SHAPE anticipated carrying much of the responsibility for the U.S. role in the occupation of Germany. So its civil affairs departments took up consideration of war crimes prosecution and even aspects of the U.S. economic policy towards Europe. By the summer of 1944, the SHAPE staff drafted a handbook for directives to be used in the military administration of Germany that recommended the occupation government import food and relief supplies into Germany and use German labor to operate coal mines, public utilities, and transportation network. Overall, SHAPE ordered that the occupation forces should ensure that the machine of German society works and works efficiently. This strategy had considerable impact on the day-to-day conduct of the war itself, because obviously you're not going to destroy stuff that you plan on using. Army Air Force officers favored saturation bombing of coal mines in 1944, for example, as a means of striking at Germany's most important energy supply. But outside specialists, notably Frank Colbon of Douglas Aircraft, who was later to be found at the CIA-dominated RAND Corporation, successfully argued that these resources should not be destroyed because they would be useful in post-war reconstruction of Germany. The bombing was canceled. So you see, they're shaping the outcome of the war during the war for the oligarchs. Morgenthau got hold of a copy of SHAPE's occupation policy handbook and a collection of State Department planning papers on Germany. He contended that their approach failed to make good on the Allies' promises. They did not hit at the roots of Nazism and would thus set the stage for renewed German aggression, which of course we know is exactly what they plan on doing. Morgenthau traveled to London in August 1944, officially to review U.S. policy towards Britain, but in reality to investigate the whole scope of what the U.S. was planning post-war. He met with Churchill, General Eisenhower, and his staff, and the U.S. staff at the European Advisory Commission. Anthony Eden provided Morgenthau with confidential notes taken at Tehran concerning the Soviets and the British and what the grand strategy was. Herbert Pell briefed him on the obstructions he was facing as part of the War Crimes Commission. Morgenthau aides, Harry Dexter White, and Bernard Bernstein provided him with detailed reports and copies of State Department and War Department's most recent policy documents. Morgenthau emerged as by far the most informed senior U.S. official about all of this. He didn't like what he saw. In Morgenthau's eyes, the same fractional split within the U.S. government over policy towards Germany and the Soviets that had characterized much of the 1930s would be used to obstruct U.S. responses to post-war Germany. In the case of war crimes policy and post-war treatment of German industrial elites, SHAPE's proposed handbook was the most immediate problem. If adopted, it would institutionalize policies that Morgenthau saw as appeasement. Germany had been arguably responsible for the past two world wars. He had seen German complicity in the brutal crimes during the Armenian genocide, and Germany's direct responsibility during World War II. The Nazis had ruled Germany with wide popular support for more than a decade. Okay, something just happened that blocked out everything on Rumble. I don't know what that is going on, but I'm going to continue. They had an effective system, of indoctrination to foster division and hatred. More than that, Germany remained an industrial power capable of dominating European businesses and influencing world events. Virtually the entire German power structure had publicly supported Hitler and participated in the regime crimes. He saw German militarism and the country's industrial banking cartel as the root causes of European wars. He believed that the German culture showed an almost instinctive tendency towards this aggression. If Germany was defeated militarily, the country was, Morgenthau thought, inherently flawed, perhaps criminally liable, and would remain the most important threat to world peace post-World War II. This, in turn, required U.S. acceptance of the Soviet Union as an equal among nations, stripping Germany of its industrial sinners. Morgenthau even argued that an entire generation of German children should be taken from their parents and educated in Allied schools. This extreme step was necessary to break the ideological hold that the Nazis had been indoctrinating into their population. Upon his return, Morgenthau approached FDR with a detailed critique of the handbook. A few days later, Roosevelt blasted the handbook and sketched out for the first time his own vision of U.S. post-war policies for Germany. This so-called handbook is pretty bad, Roosevelt wrote in a long memorandum to the Secretary of War. I should like to know how it came to be written and who approved it, down to the line items. It gives me the impression that Germany is to be restored just as much as the Netherlands and Belgium, and that the people of Germany brought back as quickly as possible to its pre-war state. That, of course, is precisely the intention of the Department of State's planners. Roosevelt went on in his memorandum, quote, "It is the utmost importance that every person in Germany should realize that this time Germany is a defeated nation. I do not want them to starve to death, but to be made an example of that aggression will not stand. They should be fed 3 times a day with soup from Army soup kitchens. That will keep them perfectly healthy, and they will remember that experience all their lives. The fact that they are a defeated nation collectively and individually must be so impressed upon them that they will hesitate to start any new war," unquote. FDR singled out pages of quotations from the directives to emphasize his point. The conception that post-war Germany should be made to work efficiently and fundamentally is effectively wrong. As Roosevelt saw it, quote, "There exists a school of thought born in London and here, which would in effect do for Germany what this government did for its own citizens in 1933 when they were flat on their backs. I see no reason for doing this." He goes on, quote, "Too many people here and in England hold the view that the German people as a whole are not responsible for what had taken place, that only a few German leaders are responsible. That, unfortunately, is not based on fact. The German people as a whole must have it driven home to them that the whole nation has been engaged in a lawless conspiracy against decencies of modern civilization, unquote. By September 4th, Morgenthau's team at Treasury Department had drawn upon a detailed counterproposal. Its suggested post-surrender program for Germany. That's what it was called. Suggested post-surrender program for Germany. Began by laying out the Tehran program for division of Germany and the creation of non-German international zones. It included bans on parades and marching bands. FDR was convinced that this was an important psychological measure and provided an outline of permissible structures for local governments once the Nazis had been driven out. The heart of the plan, however, was a series of harsh measures against German industry and against Nazi war criminals. It was referred to as the cauldron of wars in the document. It was to be stripped of all presently existing industries so weakened that it can never be an industrial area. All plants and factories were to be dismantled and moved or destroyed. The mines were to be sabotaged so as to make it difficult as possible to ever return to the mines to operation, unquote. The proposed measures against war criminals were equally harsh. Under this new revised plan, the UN would draw up a list of arch criminals, that's a quotation, whose obvious guilt had been generally recognized. They were to be summarily shot shortly after capture. A simple system of Allied military courts would be set up to deal with the lesser-known offenders. These courts should be set death sentence for any German who had murdered hostages, who had killed persons because of their race, religion, or political conviction, or who had committed certain other crimes. All members of the Gestapo, SS, and Nazi Party were to be arrested and detained, quote, until the extent of guilt of each individual is determined, unquote. Morgenthau convinced Roosevelt and Churchill to back the plan at a Quebec conference later that month. He argued that the title to the best German factories and industrial equipment should pass to the Allied countries, including the Soviet Union, as partial payment for Nazi war damages. Now, you understand that this is driving a stake into the heart of everything the Dulles brothers had arranged during the interwar period. Roosevelt is literally driving a stake into the heart of that. But Britain should become first among equals to assume virtually all of Germany's highly lucrative export trade. This move would eventually end Britain's growing financial dependence on the U.S. Some German resources would be closed down altogether to punish the Germans and not coincidentally to head off economic competition for Britain before it began. Morgenthau's aides reassured Churchill that this strategy not only had the support of the U.S. president and his Secretary of Treasury, but of England's most prominent economists, Lord Keynes, as well. Keynes had been among the most articulate opponents of heavy reparations for Germany after World War I, which gave him early support of the Morgenthau plan. On the legal front, Morgenthau strongly backed Pell's insistence that Nazis must be punished for crimes against Axis civilians and that tough immediate action be taken immediately to rescue Hungarian Jews that were on their way to Auschwitz. Learning of Pell's ongoing trouble with the State Department, Morgenthau contacted his former aide, John Peel, P-E-H-L-E, the recently appointed chief of the U.S. War Refugee Board. Peel went directly to the acting Secretary of State, Edward Stennis, Stettinus, who had taken over for the ailing Cordell Hull. Peel said that the War Refugee Board needed a public U.S. commitment to punish those who had been persecuting the prisoners if its own efforts at rescue and relief were to be successful. Failure to take action against the atrocities would be a fearful miscarriage of justice, he said. Stennis sent Pell a vague courtesy reply, but basically ignored him. Herbert Pell continued to pepper Washington with reports from the war crimes activity and requests for new instructions, by which he meant a reversal of the state's veto of prosecution of Nazis for crimes against the prison population of Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Green Hackworth ignored him as well. But the situation was becoming increasingly embarrassing for the State Department. The War Crimes Chairman, Cecil Hurst, dropped a bombshell at a press conference in late August. No war crimes case had as yet been prepared against Adolf Hitler and other senior Axis leaders, Hurst said. There were only 350 names now on the War Crimes Commission list, most of whom were all small fries who had committed crimes against British POWs. The Washington Post, the Chicago Sun, and other major papers carried on their front pages a syndicated report from London stating that Herbert Pell had been fighting a losing battle for speedy justice, but others had retarded everything. The 350 names on the list were compared to semi-official estimates, but most likely was leaked from Pell himself. That put the number of Nazi war criminals at 6 million, 1.5 million Gestapo and SS officers, and 3.5 million SA brown shirt militia troops. These men were simultaneously criminals and the greatest potential force of manpower reserve for a Nazi military rebirth. The legal basis of the Commission's work now bars punishment of Nazis for maltreating and slaughtering their prisoners or of other Axis nationalities, stateless persons, and German Jewish citizens of Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and other Allied origin citizens. The Hague Convention defines a war crime as an offense by one belligerent against the army or citizenry of another. Pell offered his solution through the newspapers. The definition of international crimes should be re-articulated, he contended, to include all offenses against persons because of race, religion, or political beliefs, irrespective of the victim's nationality. The proposal was visionary, yet it was in tune with the earlier legal conclusions of the London International Assembly and other groups. This infuriated Hackworth. Lobbying in the press for policy changes was strictly forbidden for U.S. representatives abroad. Worse than that, the prevailing political climate suggested that Pell might succeed in his effort. Hackworth began a determined campaign to have Pell dismissed once and for all. He cultivated the acting Secretary of State, Edward Stennis, who appears to have disliked Pell for his own independence and refusal to be a team player with the State Department. Pell remembered the acting Secretary of State as, quote, one of the stupidest men I have ever known, unquote. The War Department, meanwhile, organized its own effort to head off Morgenthau's initiative. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, saw Morgenthau's plan as a disaster for Germany and for Europe generally, for much of the same reason that John Foster Dulles and others had opposed the high German reparation payments during World War I. Harsh Allied punishment of Germany would lead to the unraveling of European business, he reasoned. This is the War Department guy, and he's more concerned about the surviving German business infrastructure and people that were involved in it than he is about justice. The secretary passed FDR's tough marching orders to draw up a new handbook on Germany to his aide, and guess who his aide was? None other than John McCloy. who in turn passed the problem of war crimes prosecution to a specialist on the topic, attorney Murray Bernays. You just can't make this shit up. You literally cannot make this up. Murray Bernays was an Army 06 at one point, a Colombian grad, and was originally from Russia. During 2 weeks in early September 1944, Bernays hammered out a 6-page memorandum that in time became the legal foundation for much of the work at Nuremberg. Bernays saw his task, he was to defer action once again on war crimes issue until the war was over, thereby avoiding reprisals against the U.S. POWs. In other words, he's taking his marching orders from State Department. He did not intend to develop a plan to slow the pace of Nazi atrocities, as was favored by Morgenthau, Pell, and Peel. Bernays' work at the War Department up to that time had consisted in important part in heading off attempts by the American Jewish community and from the OSS and other U.S. agencies promoting psychological warfare to open anti-Nazi war crime trials while the conflict was still going on. Bernays had trouble keeping his eyes on wartime atrocities, wrote historian Bradley Smith. Quote, by 1944, he must have seen reports of the exterminations, but they apparently did not penetrate his consciousness any more than they did for most of the others in Washington. Ingrained doubts about atrocity stories and inability to grasp the reality and the seeming futility of any effort to stop it all played a part in this failure to comprehend reports of the war crimes happening in both Auschwitz and other camps, unquote. Bernays' professional concern was primarily for European businesses, and they used the U.S. POWs as the excuse. Bernays and the War Department did not create a war crimes prosecution strategy under their own steam. They were pushed into it by the White House, Morgenthau, and Peel, and by the public. This is every indication that without this outside pressure, the War Department would have continued to stall. Regardless of what Bernays may have intended, the War Department used his legal advice primarily as a device to avoid taking any action around any of the death camps. Bernays is today widely credited with formulating a plan to try Nazi criminals for conspiracy to commit crimes, in addition to more conventional charges like murder and pillage. Charges that the Nazis had a common plan to commit war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity eventually became the centerpiece of the prosecution strategy at Nuremberg. In fact, the concept of Nazi organizations as criminal conspiracies had been discussed among legal scholars since the beginning of the war. It was developed in part by Harvard's Sheldon Gulick, Glueck, in articles written in the New Republic, the Harvard Law Review, and in his 1944 book called War Criminals, Their Prosecution and Punishment. President Roosevelt even referred directly to the Nazis as a lawless conspiracy in his order to the War Department that provided the basis for Bernays' work. It was Bernays who drafted the legal memorandum that eventually became the War Department's policy. Under U.S. criminal law, prosecutors have the option of bringing an additional charge of conspiracy anytime 2 or more people act by concert action to accomplish an unlawful purpose. Bernays suggested extending this principle to international law if the Gestapo was found by an appropriate tribunal to have been engaged in a criminal conspiracy, he reasoned. Any member of the organization could theoretically be prosecuted for each crime committed by the member, assuming that the accused Gestapo man was acting in concert with the rest of the organization. The same would be true for members of the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the German High Command. He proposed that shortly after Germany's surrender, an Allied tribunal should try several key Nazi organizations as criminal conspiracies. All of the acts of the accused organization could be placed in the public record during the prosecutor's efforts to prove the criminal conspiracy existed. This sidestepped the thorny issue of whether or not Nazis' actions prior to the outbreak of the war in 1939 could be considered war crimes, because evidence going back to 1933 could be presented even though the prosecution was seeking convictions of acts only after 1939. It also permitted prosecutors to present evidence of Nazi atrocities against Axis nationals, such as German and Hungarian Jews, at least as long as those deeds would be linked to conventional war crimes. On the other hand, Bernay's strategy rejected the effort led by Pell and Morgenthau to set any new legal precedents on crimes against humanity. In fact, it opposed almost any development in international law beyond a very strict structure that had existed since 1919 Paris Conference, which of course we know John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles had key roles in that Paris Conference. His brief failed to recognize any inherent human rights for Axis civilians beyond what was granted by the government. His proposals soon became props for those at the State Department and War Department who favored the go-slow response to any atrocities. A bruising bureaucratic war of leaks erupted in Washington during this time. Morgenthau's group appears to have cast the first stone. Pell told columnist Drew Pearson in mid-September about the sabotage of the War Crimes Commission. The following week, Pearson followed up with revelations of FDR's stunning criticism of Schaef's handbook on Germany. He also laid out Morgenthau's version of the debate inside the U.S. government over the prosecution of war crimes. The Wall Street Journal published what amounted to the State Department's reply the very next day, stressing the most extreme features of Morgenthau's plan and its attempt to deindustrialize Germany. The New York Times and the Washington Evening Star then weighed in themselves on behalf of the State Department, basically claiming that Morgenthau's strategy was war hysteria. At this point, the 1944 presidential election was only a month away, and the opposition Republican Party made the most of the scandal in the Democrat camp. Republican candidate Thomas Dewey charged that Morgenthau had handed the Nazis a propaganda bonanza and continued that German fears of Morgenthau had caused the Weimar to dig in deeper and fight harder. The newspaper barrage dealt Morgenthau a serious political blow. FDR stepped away from Morgenthau's plan in the weeks that followed. That's why, if you don't understand the backdrop to all of this, you really can't comprehend what the role that the media plays in all of this. They were favoring, the State Department put out that they were favoring a more moderate approach. After Roosevelt won re-election, Dewey retracted the charge that Morgenthau had contributed to Germany's will to fight, but by then, the political damage was already done. Let me bring up Bridget. Herbert Pell was eager to clear the air with Roosevelt. In early December, he used the occasion of his son's marriage to return to the U.S. He hoped to win the president's backing in the debate over the atrocities. At the State Department, Green Hackworth had other plans. That November, Congress had placed new restrictions on the president's emergency fund, the source of Pell's salary, during the past 18 months. The money, as such, was nearly meaningless to Herbert Pell because he could afford to work without pay. But Hackworth knew that without a congressional appreciation for the post, Pell would be legally forced off the commission. The legal advisor sent his aide, Catherine Fite, F-I-T-E, to Capitol Hill with a budget proposal that would put the request for Pell's salary at the bottom of the list of states' priorities. Fight spoke in favor of the appropriation for Pell, but in terms that were very clear to Congress that they did not care for Pell's work at state and it needed to be deprioritized. After several meetings, a congressional conference committee deleted Pell's salary during the markup. And the 1945 budget was passed without his salary. Herbert Pell met with Hackworth at least twice during Fight's trips to the Hill, and at no time did Hackworth tell Pell what he was doing. Hackworth used the meetings to squash Pell's request to attend war crimes policy gatherings then underway at the War Department and to pour cold water on Pell's assertions that FDR was backing his plan to reclassify crimes as war crimes. He would go on to say, I thought I made it clear that nothing final and definite could be said at this time. Hackworth rebuked Pell. The U.S. representative should not act on any of his impressions. Acting Secretary of State Stennis also knew that Pell's ouster was immediate, but he too did not tell him when they were meeting face to face. Hackworth and Stennis worked through the Christmas holiday to prepare the paperwork for FDR that they hoped would administer Pell's coup. They rehashed Pruis's allegations against Pell from the previous spring. And remember, Pruis was sent over there as a spy by Hackworth. They falsely assured the president that Pell's concerns were now being addressed in a new legal committee made up by Hackworth, Bernays, and other government attorneys. The only real question left, they said, was whether Roosevelt should personally tell Pell that his job was over, or if he preferred state do it. Roosevelt replied to Stennis, you do it. Hackworth believed he was meanwhile making considerable progress in his meeting with Bernays at the War Department. To Bernays' face, Hackworth accepted the War Department's proposal, but in working sessions, he helped draft policy directives for U.S. commanders in the field that were as close as possible to Hackworth's strategy on war crimes. At the same time, Hackworth continued a behind-the-scenes effort to squash any compromise plan that he was drafting with Bernays. Hackworth now declassified memo documents that he continued to try to head off the use of a conspiracy prosecution against the SS and Nazi Party for at least the next 6 months, in part due to Hackworth's prompting. Attorney General Francis Biddle, Biddle, also opposed Pell's initiatives in the War Department's suggestions for conspiracy prosecution of any Nazi, raising many of the same objections to war crimes that Robert Lansing, who again is the uncle of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, had previously raised. The British Foreign Office remained of one mind with Hackworth on all of these issues, and its legal attaché in Washington leaked to him the classified combined Chief of Staff policy papers on war crimes for his personal use in convincing others in Washington to toe the line. These orders limited war crime prosecutions to narrowly defined cases, made no mention of crimes against humanity, and specifically excluded any act committed by enemy authorities against their own nationals, which of course would extend to any Nazi-occupied Axis territory and the atrocities that happened there, because they were now considered citizens of Axis powers. Equally important, the combined chiefs of staff contended that no war crime suspect had to be handed over to any other allied country except by arrangements among the governments concerned. In the world of diplomatic etiquette, this last statement was worded to undermine compliance with the obligations of the Moscow Declaration without openly defying the agreement. the importance of blocking delivery of suspects was to grow considerably in the months ahead, and eventually it emerged as one of the most important means by which war criminals escaped justice. In early January 1945, Hackworth's efforts to engineer Pell's dismissal unexpectedly blew up. Shortly after FDR's confidential note authorizing the State Department to dismiss Pell, the president met Pell for lunch at the White House. As Pell tells the story in his unpublished memoirs, FDR reassured him of continuing support and encouraged him to return to London to lead the War Crimes Commission in taking a tough stand on Nazi crimes against the Jewish people. Elated, Herbert Pell returned to the State Department for what he believed was a routine meeting with Edward Stennicus. It did not work out that way. Stennicus abruptly fired Pell without warning and with minimum courtesy. The dismissed War Crime Commission commissioner immediately called the White House, but FDR didn't return his phone call. Pell refused to give up and took his case to the newspapers, charging that the State Department leadership was squashing prosecution of Nazi atrocities. He used his dismissal to bring new attention and credibility to his earlier accusations that the State Department had sabotaged or obstructed the whole range of activities that were taking place overseas. Newspaper editorial writers and columnists took up Pell's cause and, more importantly, focused attention on the legal technicalities that Green Hackworth and the other department officials had quietly used to justify their policy of inaction in the face of war crimes. The Washington Post editorial condemned Pell's firing and attacked certain legalistic minds of old school individuals who had failed to find any precedent in international law for the punishment of a country's murder of its own citizens, and therefore refused to approve U.S. participation in the prosecution of Germans who had destroyed entire races of people. The problem, the Post continued in a second editorial, was certain well-entrenched functionaries in the State Department was responsible. The liberal New York Daily, PM, published a series of investigative articles on the whole affair. Who are the U.S. officials seeking to sabotage trial of Nazi killers? The paper headlined. Legally, Hitler is still safe because the U.S. State Department policy was, in PM's words, making punishment of men who perpetrated this war upon the world impossible. The firestorm of publicity forced the State Department publicly to cave in on the issue of prosecuting Germans for crimes against German Jews. Though state continued to resist Morgenthau and Pell's broader conceptions of breaking up German corporate elite, State Department issued a formal statement insisting, quite falsely, that it had supported the aims of Pell's program all along. Flat out lie. Pell became a martyr, in effect, for the hardline approach to Nazi crimes that had been espoused by people like Morgenthau. By crudely dismissing him, historian Michael Blaney wrote about the incident, the State Department enabled Pell to arouse public wrath to such intensity that the department was forced to yield. Pell's abrupt dismissal helped make the Nuremberg trials actually occur. The factual conflicts in Washington over what to do with Germany also began to emerge among U.S. military commanders in Europe well before the shooting war ended. The U.S. troops crossed into Germany in the fall of 1944, and it was there that the U.S. made the first effort to establish a post-Nazi government. The opposing drives underlying U.S. policy towards continuity of German elites as a means of attaining stability on one hand, or towards a purge of the system that had given birth to Hitler on the other. Within days of the U.S. victory, there emerged an elite made up of technicians, lawyers, engineers, businessmen, manufacturers, and churchmen, according to military sociologist Saul Padover, who led a U.S.-sponsored research team. Quote, this elite is shrewd, strong-willed, and aggressive. It occupies every important job, unquote, in the new German administration that the U.S. permitted under the occupation. Padover's team conducted an in-depth psychological and sociological interviews with dozens of people, including the notables identified there. Strong point, especially in dealing with Americans, is that they are anti-Nazi or non-Nazi, Padover wrote. During the war, most held senior positions at different manufacturing plants. They were the leading war production plant, a striking fact that this new Aachen elite is its comparative youth. Their ages run from 33 to 50. They all represent the upper middle class. The leading men in this group had spent their working lives and grew prosperous under the Nazi system, and they knew little else. They had an anti-democratic conception of government and its leadership. Aachen's new leadership clique had a fairly clear-cut, long-range political economic plan, the plan about which the U.S. military government knew little and cared less was a significant index of what one may expect from similar business groups in Germany, he contended. Sorry about that. Their vision, he said, was an authoritarian corporate state, nothing that reflected a democracy, somewhat similar to the Austrian model of the 1930s. Economically, they favored a tightly knit community of owners and managers of small enterprise supported by labor aristocracy of foremen and artisans. The new leaders were said to be violently opposed to any popular election, political parties, or even trade unions. Under the nose of the military government, he said, the new administration was setting up the framework for an authoritarian, hierarchical, bureaucratic, corporate fascism, a kind of system that even the Nazis had rejected. This group entrenched itself in the city administration by placing insiders in control of all the local posts. The new administration chief's building contractor and leader of the Industrial Bureau, for example, had been the largest contractor under the Nazis and made extensive use of forced labor. The executive officer and personnel director, Amp de Hipt, HIPT, had been a Gestapo liaison inside the city's most important war production plant, with responsibility for enforcing loyalty among the employees. In short, the post-war leaders who emerged at Aachen were not ideological Nazis from the mold of Hitler or Himmler. They were instead the political, economic, and social technocrats who had actually ran Germany during Hitler's regime under the watchful eye of the Nazi Party activists. There was an alternative for the administration of occupied German cities, though it could have been implemented only in the face of resistance of the existing elites. At Aachen, the town and its surrounding had been in the hands of a coalition government made up of left, centrist, social democrats, and communists for most of the decade prior to Hitler's assumption of power. One of the first public opinion surveys conducted by the U.S. forces in Germany found that 70% of the women and 83% of the men interviewed at random said that they would vote for a communist or socialist if elections were held. Theoretically, the citizens would have elected a more anti-Nazi administration had the military government permitted elections to be held. The American response to the emerging leadership clique foreshadowed what was to unfold in the U.S. occupation zone over the next year. This was months before Germany's surrender, at a time when Roosevelt was still in the White House. U.S. unity with the Soviets was still strong. The anti-Nazi sentiment among the U.S. forces was at an all-time high. Behind the scenes, the military government offices was a storm. It revolved around the basic question of retention of Nazis and other non-desirables in office, the military government itself was split into three wings: right, left, and center. A majority of the military government officers were on the extreme right and supported the new administration, their business, and said that they were efficient and not political. A minority consisting of the deputy and two lieutenants were more on the left, urging the elimination of all Nazis and Nazi associated people from civilian governments. In the center was Major J, the military governor officer, and I don't know why we don't have his full name, but Major J was an affable officer who knew little about Germany and nothing about the German language. He was perfectly neutral on the subject of Nazis. There were 55 Nazis in middle and high levels of post in the local offices. Major J said that one must go slowly in getting rid of them because they were indispensable. Where, he asked, would you find competent people who are not Nazis? Padover's study concluded that the root of U.S. inertia in Germany involved politics, bureaucracy, and social attitudes against the leading class. The military government team is judged on its efficiency and performance record. Thus, when the military government group would enter a city, its first consideration was functional, not political. The political intelligence officer that accompanied the military team into Austin said that it was almost impossible, given the matrix that they were given to operate under, to do anything other than keep Nazis in place. I'm sure that's a coincidence. The military government team will employ almost anybody it believes capable of putting a town on a functioning basis because that's what they were being graded on. Thus, Nazi sympathizers, party members, and German nationalists were appointed by the military government as the only available specialist. These specialists who looked extremely presentable and have professional backgrounds then placed their like-minded friends as their assistants. As a consequence, the military government initial indifference to politics in the situation led to a political mess. Then comes the complicated attempts by the Army counterintelligence units to weed out quote-unquote undesirables, and the military government officers finding themselves in an unpleasant position because they were being graded on the efficiencies of the Nazis. Padover's study led to a scandal in reforms at about the same time the controversy over Pell's dismissal erupted. Congressional and public pressure led the U.S. military governor to purge about 24 former Nazis from the Aachen government. Most of these officials were in fact small fries, including the janitor at a local school. They didn't really get rid of the bad guys. They responded to U.S. public opinion surveys asking openly, "Are you going to sit back now and let the big Nazis rule?" asked an elderly lady. "Now that you are satisfied that you have thrown out the Nazi janitor." So even they saw through what was going on. So that's chapter 12. And that really is the heart of this book. It shows you the extent to which our government officials will sabotage our government officials when they are not towing the line of big business. And what you have to understand, and we'll get into it a little bit in the next chapter, is what's driving all of this. Because what's driving all of this is the business oligarchs who already have a determined end state in mind, and that has absolutely nothing to do with holding anybody accountable. It has to do with their business interest. And those people that are in the State Department are representing those people, not us. And they are certainly not representing what may be morally right or wrong in holding people accountable in war atrocities. And again, when you bring that forward after you've set this precedence on, it gives them basically a blank check, which we see, quite frankly, with the setting up of these same people. John McCloy, you just heard. John McCloy goes on to be part of every bad actor thing that happens after World War II. He's in the heart of it. He was the governor over all of Germany for the Marshall Plan, which funded Operation Gladio. He sets up the apparatus to basically take what existed within the Nazi apparatus, the fascist type organization, and spreads it across the world. And they were the enablers that allowed that to move worldwide. So again, my contention has always been, after about the first 6 months of looking at Operation Gladio, is post-World War II transition from an overt war to a covert war, basically using the principles of the fascist arrangement that had been set up in Germany. And you can just leave Hitler out of this. This was corporate interest that were capturing slave labor in order to enrich themselves. And John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, as lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell, set a lot of those ties to both the UK and the US oligarchs into that system. And then you see worldwide using the now standing military and the CIA to go into country after country after country and implement this fascist system that allowed them to basically enslave people as laborers into a system that enriched themselves. So there you have it. What you guys got? Where did Bridget go?
Yeah, I saw her come up earlier. I gave her another invite.
Okay.
She may have gotten thrown off.
I put her back as co-host, see if she can come back up. Renee, go ahead.
Yeah, question please. So any idea of what percentage of industry was captured during these, for the World War I and World War II? Like, did they, the oligarch industrialists went in, and what percentage would you say of what was originally German industry did they take during that time, which then later led to the template of, the rest of the world, so of how they go in and take their industry?
So it really isn't taking it. So the way they did this was they intertwined interest. So for example, Ford went and opened subsidiary Ford plants in Europe, and they place the existing oligarchs in Europe on their subsidiary. And then the German oligarchs opened subsidiaries in the United States, and they placed the oligarchs in the United States on their board. So it's an entwining of interest in order for them to all act as one. And so what you find, and at the heart of this were law firms like Sullivan and Cromwell, with lawyers like John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, who made all of these arrangements. And I'll give you an example that's not even related to World War II. When in the book about this being all about pipelines and oil, I forget the name of the book, I found Alan Dulles in Baku, Azerbaijan, working on behalf of Standard Oil, buying interests that had formerly been owned by the Nobel oil family in Sweden. And so they intertwine their business interest so that basically they're all going to act as one because it all benefits them. And so that's where I found out that Allen Dulles met with George de Morgenschild's father, because George de Morgenschild was the Baku representative for the Nobel family and all of their oil concessions in Azerbaijan. And so they were in meetings together, hashing out, because Allen Dulles was at Sullivan and Cromwell making an international deal for Standard Oil. And I'm like, wait a minute, de Morgenschild, is that George de Morgenschild? Yes, that was his father. And Allen became very good friends with the de Morgenschild, so he knew George since he was 10 years old. And you fast forward to JFK's assassination and Allen Dulles's placement on the Warren Commission, and who was his star witness? George de Morgenschild. So all of this stuff creates this elite group of people that all operate as one. And that's how this hybrid is set up. They did the same thing after the Bolshevik Revolution. You found J.P. Morgan, you found the Warburgs, you found General Electric. General Electric was paid in stolen Tsar's gold that they reminted in Sweden. And yes, Sweden comes up in just about every one of these stories. To go in, and supposedly this awful regime that we've been told existed, and I'm not saying it wasn't, because it was, and after the Bolshevik Revolution, they all got rich. And of course, we know that Wall Street and the City of London funded the Bolshevik Revolution. And then they all go in, all of our railroad titans are in what eventually becomes the Soviet Union, laying railroad tracks. GE's in there electrifying it, just like we're doing with China right now. We go in and enable the enemy, so we have an enemy so that they can continue this perpetual bullshit on us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a multi-pronged plan to go in. So you got to get in the bankers, the industry, the attorneys, the terror factor. Like, it's multi-pronged, that you got to infiltrate the place you're going after, the media, the everything.
Yes.
They go in on all these angles to boomerang it in their favor and join forces.
Yeah? Yes, they create a spider web around it and then slowly eat the prey. Mega Nuke.
Colonel, I want to say you have gained a staunch supporter from this account. I appreciate all, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in this space. Appreciate your bringing to light the real history. On that note, now that all of this is getting exposed, how do we keep this from happening again in the future? Everywhere we look, it's the same playbook over and over and over, and nobody seems to be able to stop it. And it may not be appropriate for this space since you're recording it, but
no, I don't have that problem
to get past this.
I do, because first of all, my mission is exposing our history, so that we can have a group of people that understand what our real history is to advocate for the necessary changes that need to occur, because people aren't willing to sacrifice if they don't see a reason to sacrifice. If you know your history and you know what these people have been up to, and we have to tighten our belt a little bit to get rid of these people, you're willing to do it. But if you don't understand the history and you have somebody like Donald Trump come along and there's going to be a shakeup in this spider manufacturing web business, people aren't necessarily going to have the fortitude to see it through its end if they don't understand the repercussions of not dealing with it. So I think information is the number one thing, which is why you will see my account completely throttled and people stay away from me like I'm a piranha. And the people that do that, the people that block me, the people that don't want this information getting out, exposes themselves by doing it. That's number one. Number two, I have said often that from 2017, there has been monumental, earth-shattering changes that if you don't understand the history, you don't even know occurred. And one of the ones that I talk about most often is a company by the name of Crypto AG. It was critical that this company existed. It existed during World War II. It existed in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and it was completely under the control of the CIA, in which they put encrypted devices into every country, 120 of them, of the most critical countries around the world, so they could spy on every diplomatic cable. And when they spied on all of these, there was not a single thing that happened from World War II until 2020, when Trump took the company down, that was not known to the CIA and the German BND. Not a single thing. They knew everything about it. And keep in mind, the German BND was created by Nazi Reinhard Gehlen, Alan Dulles' buddy. So they knew all of the stuff that was happening, all of the atrocities, all of the bullshit that was happening that they were quote unquote surprised about. And so they knew everything. They knew about the invasion of the 7-Day War in 1967. They knew that Egypt had deployed 75,000 troops down to Yemen because the British had sabotaged a bunch of shit down there. So they knew that the timing was perfect for that to happen because they had sold Egypt this encrypted backdoor bullshit. Everything that they did in Iran was one of the first customers. The overthrow of Mossadegh. They knew every single thing that was happening because all of their diplomatic communications were spied on. So once you understand that, and that company existed up until 2020, and most of the countries didn't know that they were being spied on. So the taking down of many of the drug trafficking organizations during Trump's first term, and it is continued in spades now by declaring the cartels a terrorist organization. They're a terrorist organization created by the CIA. So all of this stuff is happening. And if you understand Operation Gladio and all of this stuff that has happened, and you know the real history, not the fake history, you can actually spot these things. The taking down of USAID, that was one of their major funding sources for the CIA to do overtly covert operations by destabilizing countries. So I have hope that all of it's being dismantled right now. And I'm using history and the knowledge of what really happened and who was really involved to bring that forward, to watch what the dismantling of it as we sit here today. Illini, go ahead.
Let me offer sort of I come from behavioral finance, so let me try to offer a game theoretic model to folks, and some folks will kind of find it familiar. Basically, I think it's pretty empirically obvious that human beings are inherently, we're sinners and we're corrupt. And when people, engage in sin as a group, it starts to turn into a conspiracy. And then as part of conspiracies, you ultimately have, a certain amount of extortion and retaliation that goes along with it to keep people in there and to keep the conspiracy going. And, we observed this, thousands of years ago, everybody kind of knows on a spiritual level. And, one of the things that we observed at the same time was that, there's a connection between the fact that we're flawed as human beings, and the fact that the people who actually run and control things are kind of under the control of something that isn't good. And that's kind of how that's kind of the model that we're operating under. So how do you deal with that? Number one is you take away the power of extortion. You try to make it easier for people. Well, number one is you try and get secrecy out of the government. That makes it harder for there to be, conspiracies. And then number two, you try to take away that power of extortion somehow. Obviously there's, a 2,000-year-old religion that originates in Jerusalem that tries to take away, the extortive power of our own human flaws. But if you can figure out a way to break that model, and a lot of it is probably taking away secrecy from the government, trying to make it smaller or at least less complicated, trying to have, more ways that information can get out, and also having a system where, we love our enemies, we pray for those who persecute us, and we try to find ways to forgive each other. That may be a way out of this.
So let me capitalize on what you just said, because it goes back to what I just said. The extortion part of this is critical to keep this system going, which is why you have all of these blackmail scandals. It keeps, I have said many times that this operation has an element of money, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking, and blackmail makes the axle on the wheel keep going. And the one thing that became very clear early on when Trump in 2015 made the announcement that he was going to run, and all of this time span that has happened, is you can't extort him. He has been open about every single thing he did. He has not been corruptible. The mafia in New York even said, "Why didn't you get something on him?" And the guy says, "Because there's nothing to get on him. He won't do anything bad." And he has walked in circles with the mafia. I point out all of the Resorts International in the Bahamas. He has walked side by side with some very bad guys. And in every time that he was given the opportunity to be corrupt, he refused to do it. He threw Jeffrey Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago. He has established his bona fides. He went into the beast in Hollywood. He had his own television show, and they couldn't touch him. So you have to have somebody like that on the inside that shines a light on all of these people, which is what he does masterfully every single time. And these dumbasses fall for it every single time. So let me give a shout out to Overbuilt Automotive for a Rumble rant. Thank you very much. And you're very welcome. I am glad to be here doing what I do. I wouldn't be anywhere else. Let's see. Megan Nuke, did you want to respond to that?
Well, as a fellow veteran, if there is a mission that needs to be accomplished, you don't talk yourself through it. There has to be some action. And that's kind of the point that I was trying to make before. One person other than Jesus Christ is not going to change the world. He has to have support, or her has to have support, and a willing cadre of individuals to back them up. And I'm from a military perspective, getting really tired of all the talk.
Well,
saying.
See, I don't see it as talk. I see the coalition that he has built around the world as part and parcel of this entire thing. He makes strategic connections to people that are going to allow for this transition. But again, it's because I've been doing this now for 2.5 years. I see everything from a completely different perspective. And I can appreciate we need action. You're absolutely right. Ellie?
Hello, Colonel, and thank you that you allow me to speak. As you said rightly, greetings from Germany. And as you said correctly, we have to remember our real history. And you mentioned the Gehlen operation from the BND. Do you see a connection between the secret services, the CIA, and the Gehlen BND secret service today? Are they still working together?
All of the post-World War II intelligence apparatuses work as a collective hive. So yes, I see all of, especially NATO, all NATO, but if you isolate it just to NATO, you miss the bigger picture because as we've discovered, the Korean CIA, the KCIA, the secret services in Japan, they all collectively work together. And they share, now not exclusively, because they do keep their own secrets for their own ability to manipulate certain conditions. But yes, they do. It was the German BND bought in secretly to Crypto AG for a very long period of time. They hired a I want to say it was a Swiss front company that they used to when they ran Crypto AG the entire time. But at one point, the guy that owned the company on a piece of paper got old, and they were afraid his son was going to inherit it. And so the CIA and the German BND created a fake company that supposedly bought it from the old man, so they didn't have to worry about his son. And they owned that company for decades together and shared that information. Both of them had back doors to the information. It got exposed in Europe, and Germany basically sold their part to the CIA. And that doesn't mean they still didn't have access to the information. Again, this is like paperwork. They sold their control, partnership to the CIA. And again, they were using a front company. All of this stuff is hidden through fake banks and fake companies. But they all collectively work together, especially MI6, the Five Eyes, but all of them. Everything in NATO is connected.
Colonel, just to add another piece of information, I pinned to the nest a paper by Jeffrey Birds. He's a Harvard professor. This is peer reviewed. It's in the Carl Beck papers, and he talks about the relationship between Reinhard Gehlen and Stepan Bandera and how the CIA during the early Cold War was able to basically use those connections to forge a connection with OUN, and Bandera. That still kind of persists, today. That kind of persists all the way through Euromaidan. You had the EU out there as part of the Azov brigades. They're a descendant of OUN.
Yep.
Their coup. You had, John McCain, you had John Brennan out there, you had, EU dignitaries, and we were all kind of working through some of those same, intelligence connections that got forged at the end of World War II.
Yes. Excellent point. All along?
Colonel, we know that duopoly is working together, and we know they use their two scissor blades to divide potential coalitions against it on behalf of the CIA. The reason I mention this is because sometimes people are like, why bother, why, to me, there are sometimes, why do you seem to attack the Democrats more than the Republicans, as if they are somehow more CIA or closer to the CIA than the Republicans are? I don't think that they are closer to the Republicans, closer to CIA than the GOP is, but rather, as we know historically, the GOP was, like, from the beginning, the East Coast GOP was the base of the CIA in 1948 with the Dewey Bush and whatchamacallit faction who lost to Truman in Dewey Bush and whatchamacallit faction that lost to Truman in 1948. Yet since then, the Democrats have kind of become like the new, much more media-friendly sort of aircraft carrier, metaphorically speaking, of CIA. They're much more the media and communications base. We see this on CNN abundantly clearly. We of course see it on MSNBC beyond any question, you know, where we see these former W. Bush White House aides suddenly become the news anchor heroes of MSNBC, and like 40-year-olds don't even know it, you know? It's a level of brainwashing, you know, that Goebbels could only have dreamed. So why then do I think that the 1968 RFK campaign is actually the turning point in U.S. history and the key point to kind of go on the offensive against the duopoly and the CIA, our de facto government? It's because, in my opinion, there's nothing more 180-degree opposite of what the CIA right-wing Democrats are right now than the 1968 RFK for president campaign. Why? Because that's the campaign where you see, to the greatest extent, the rank and file opposing their bought-off union leadership, as in AFL-CIO's George Meany. And literally, you know, they forced somebody to become their mouthpiece of the actual rank and file that was coming back in coffins from Vietnam to actually oppose the corruption that was the essence of, you know, co-opted unions that had coalesced with the Cold War Democrats and really the Cold War GOP as well, namely Walter Reuther. And so when he joins the RFK campaign, when RFK suggests the Poor People's Campaign to MLK, when MLK backs the RFK campaign, and not only does the entire DNC completely erase every aspect of that, but the purported left, which we know is foundation-funded bullshit, right? We know that they're basically paid to punch where it will never matter. They also completely erased the 1968 RFK campaign, which had the largest working class coalition in U.S. history. That is the proof, more than anything else in all 400 years of American history. That's the biggest hypocritical thing you can imagine. That's how to go on offense against this duopoly. You don't attack the prosecutor. His job is always to prosecute you. When you have a fake defense team, that's what you go after, right? There's a reason the CIA literally replaced RFK and MLK's defense team with a new defense team. It was to collaborate with the prosecutor. So the double censorship that we see in both the big media and the fake alternative media, complete censorship of not only the 3 assassinations, but even more importantly, the coalition that made those assassinations so necessary, is screaming to us Achilles heel of the system. Tomorrow is the most, you know, it's the anniversary of the last turning point in U.S. history, and nobody will mention it.
So
Orwell could never have gone this far.
So
it's telling us where to attack.
Yeah. So to your point, and we have covered that in several of the videos that I've done with War Hamster, where you have these law firms that are on the defense side, and then you have the people from law firms on the prosecution side. And oftentimes you can draw the schematic back to where they cross each other. So they are literally controlling both sides of the argument. And that there's so many examples of that. So yeah, thank you. Ron, go ahead.
I wanted to address something that Mega was talking about, and I sensed that he was a little frustrated, maybe with like lack of action, or did you sense that, or is that me?
Yeah, no,
You didn't sense
that?
Okay.
Everybody is, but as I pointed out, the current administration just crossed the 100 days. You are talking about something that, even if you just were to take the peace post World War II to today, has been developing for over 70 years. You're not going to be able to dismantle the beast in 100 days. You're just not going to be able to do that.
I know I believe that too.
Right. But if you look at all of the things that have collectively happened since 2016, you can clearly see the beast is being dismantled if you actually know some of the aspects of the beast, which is why we're here learning about them.
I would agree with that as well. And I would also say that the absence of really substantive information in the news media is evidence that a lot of those systems have been broken down. If we see, I hear a lot of people who are really frustrated. Well, I don't see any arrests, or I don't hear this, or I don't hear that. And to me, the lack of information means to me that they're sealing up leaks and getting rid of leaks. But with that said, I wanted to ask your opinion on, and I know I don't want to say it's off topic, but I want to ask your opinion on why did Trump ban it, not like get rid of that Waltz guy completely and put him over into the United Nations, or put him into the United Nations position, or to have him seek that position. What's your thoughts on that? The guy who was he was seen, witnessed to be using the Signal app.
Yeah, I know who he is. He's a congressman from Florida. I'm very familiar with who he is.
All right.
I don't know. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you.
Okay.
I don't know why he was in the administration to begin with. I have been very critical of him for a very long time. However, I do know that people are placed in certain positions in government, especially in Trump administrations, to be able to map their networks. And that was illustrated in his first presidency. Because once they're on the government payroll, you have access to all of their information. And it becomes a lot easier to map that. And I don't think his removal is isolated from the 100 others that just got removed, because they operate in a hive. And so that could clearly, and honestly, I think we're going to not be in the UN. There couldn't be a more dead-end job than the UN.
I was thinking the same thing.
So again, but having him there on the government payroll allows you to map networks. And you have to understand from both a psychological warfare perspective and an information warfare perspective, having people under the auspices of working inside the government is very important in order to find out where those networks are.
I appreciate I did not know about the mapping of the network. My assumption was that anytime Trump put somebody on up front, that it was for them to expose themselves. I didn't know about the back end that you just talked about. So thank you for that.
Let me tell you about something I'm very familiar with. As a commander, I had a situation where it was very obvious to me somebody was doing something very bad. And once I had the discussion with OSI, my intention was to fire the person because we had the computer data that illustrated the person was doing something very bad. And I was told that it was my decision, but I was told that it would be much more beneficial because it wasn't, like pedophilia or something like that. Nobody was being harmed. That we allow the person under observation for 30 to 60 days so we could find out what the entire network was. So I know personally how that's done. I saw the ability to do that firsthand. And again, I knew that the capability is there because at my job, when I first became an officer, was processing people for discharge. I was in charge of, in like the first 3 assignments we have like a corporate disciplinary board that the person that was in my job headed, and it had the legal officer, the OSI detachment commander, myself, and the chief of police at all of the bases, so that we could track them. We knew who was under investigation. It was all classified information. You were not allowed to share any of the information in those meetings. And I watched this unfold. We had a guy out in Los Angeles that was part of a network stealing identification cards out of Pass and ID on the base. He just happened to be an Air Force Academy graduate at the time. And so the entire time the investigation was going on, he was not working alone. I watched that unfold, and anything that came along, there was an office at our personnel center you had to identify, so that there's a secret hold that you put on people if they're coming up in an assignment window, that they're not going to be given PCS orders, which are just orders to move to another base during the investigation. And so this entire apparatus works behind the scenes, and it's all classified. And then they either prefer charges or they don't, and all of the holds are released. I'm
really glad. I'm really glad that I asked that question, because you have illuminated a whole new world for me just based on just what you just said. That I didn't realize and hadn't even considered. So I thank you for that.
Sure. So that whole thing goes on, and the whole ability to monitor people's communications when they work for the government as the commander or whoever is in charge of the organization, you have the ability to do that. If you put it in writing anywhere on a government system, it's never not there. It can be recovered. It doesn't matter if you try to erase all your emails or whatever, and we've had people do that. You cannot erase your history. You can tell when people get to work because the first thing they do, sign on to their computer. There's a lot you can get from monitoring internal information. So, Ellie?
Thank you, Colonel, that you answered my questions to the connection between the BND and the CIA, and it's just go on. And it's a problem how to tell to the normies, no? That it never has ended. From the perspective of a German, this all has ended with the Nuremberg process. Yeah, when the Nazis were charged for their crimes. And the normies in Germany, they don't get it. Okay, but what I want to thank you for your service. I think that's what is called in the USA.
Yes, thank you
for your service. And I have a question. I saw an episode of you when you mentioned this secret society, Skull and Bones. And in my research, I saw that they have all the key positions Do you agree with that?
So they don't have all of them, but they are placed in very strategic positions to effect control of the entire organization. Because Skull and Bones is not the only secret society. It's just the first one we started off with. There's several of them. And the others, there's other ones, like the Pilgrim Society is another one that has both a British element and a US element to it. And they have some overlapping memberships. So there's many of these organizations. And again, it's like a spider web. They put some of the Skull and Bones, like in Bilderberg and the Club of Rome and the Committee of 300, what's the organization? La Circle. That was, a big part of Germany, France, and Britain. And so they have overlapping membership on all of these, or all of the secret societies all end up on all of these same, the Council of Foreign Relations, the British RIIA. I just talked the other day about the on Alpha Warriors show about the German American Council that had, it's just crazy, the network that all of these people, and again, they're overlapping on all of them. So it's quite amazing. Illini, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was going to respond to the whole, how they communicate about the CIA and, the Nazis. On the Skull and Bones point, Skull and Bones is exclusively a Yale organization. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of people who run, high-level stuff in the federal government who, didn't go to Yale. If they're a member of the CF, like Richard Helms, for instance, I think, Colby was from Princeton. I think Helms was from Columbia. So there's a lot of people who aren't part of that organization.
Yes.
It's simply one. It's maybe one tentacle.
One tentacle of the octopus.
In terms of what I'd offer to Germans, I think you can, if you were to take a look at that Jeffrey Bird's paper. He was, a Harvard professor. It's a peer-reviewed paper. It was written in 2003 when it wasn't controversial at all. It was based on declassified CIA-sourced FOIA documents. He's getting his information straight from the CIA. There's no provenance issues with it. And he basically comes out and he says that the CIA basically gave all this cover to these Nazi war criminals. Reinhard Gehlen, Stepan Bandera. The West basically covered for them. We had a Nazi war criminals, Bandera, hiding out in West Germany.
Yeah.
That's all in that document. It's all been peer-reviewed. It's all based on declassified KGB and CIA documents. I think some of the Bandera stuff is, coming straight from the CIA. I would just put it in, I try to do this as, your typical matter of fact, Midwestern American. I think Germans are even better at putting it straightly and matter-of-factly in certain ways. Oh yeah, this is the simple truth, and I don't see why it's so controversial or we have to argue about it.
Right. Hold on just a second. I wanted to look up one of the other ones.
We should really throw people through a fit, by the way. At least Americans.
Yeah, that's true. So if you go to your point, if you go to somebody like Frank Wisner was one of the most crucial people in Operation Gladio and the overthrow of governments during the initial phases. He obviously was part of the OSS, blah, blah, blah. There is a secret society at the University of Virginia, and it is considered the most secret of secret societies, called the Seven Society. And it was founded in 1905. The only way, there's no list that exists of any of the members. The only way you know that they were a member is when they die, there is a carnation placed on their gravesite. And not just any carnation, magnolia, black magnolia is placed on their graves. That is the only indication that they're a member of that secret society. There are lots and lots of secret societies. Bridget, go ahead.
Okay, bear with me as I try and organize. Thank you, Ellie, for being here, because I have friends that I grew up with who came from Austria and Germany, and they're part of my family, and many of them actually fled at the end of World War II. And also researching into the Gelen organization and how it was linked with it was Operation Gladio. It was what the CIA, and that was the impetus of the intertwining of the CIA. And I mean, it was part of the fabric of this whole network that we've been quilting since starting in that time. However, the Colonel has also gone back to the Fabian Society, which predates World War II and also predates all of this, but it, again, is part of that, like a fabric that is woven with these secret societies, including even the Knights of Malta. I can't tell you how many of them were part of the Knights of Malta. Now, does that mean that all of the Knights of Malta are bad? No, but it would be impossible to deny that there are a significant number of members. And it seemed like at one point they realized that as their operations were being exposed, like they did in P2, which is Propaganda Due, which was the Italian
Masonic Lodge.
Italian Masons.
Thank you.
Masonic Lodge.
Masons.
Yeah.
That got exposed. They began to start with these like backup organizations, and it was ironic because they even used the bad organizations, the organizations that they created, they would use to create the backup organizations, like we saw with UNESCO. Yeah. And then creating the World Wildlife Foundation.
Yeah.
And that way, even if UNESCO was destroyed and exposed, and even when they were, those same heads would go ahead and start a new organization. And it would just change names, just like the League of Nations, although it was not necessarily connected to NATO, a lot of the same people. And you see the same with a lot of the Nazi family members who are now holding parliamentary seats. And it is a definite woven, intentional, but there is not one organization. It is a fabric that is made of hundreds and if not thousands of organizations. And just like we saw the collapse of USAID, collapsing USAID seems like one thing, but that was feeding so many of these pieces of that fabric. What we're watching is them pulling those threads apart, and it becomes a mesh.
Yeah.
And once it starts to collapse at some point, it is a house of cards. They were destroying us with our own money. They were destroying us with the fabric of our own foundation. And as we see it become more mesh-like, like a house of cards, I believe you will see in our lifetime the collapse.
Very well said, Bridget. Mega, and then Illini.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Ron there. I know he left the space. My frustration, I think, is aligned with a lot of Americans and other folks around the world's frustration. We don't live in 1920 anymore. It don't take 10 to 20 years to find out what is going wrong. You can get fact checked on the fly of whether something is right or wrong. And I think that's where the frustration is. We have an information warp speed going on, and dealing with corruption, dealing with fraud, dealing with backstabbing individuals everywhere you look. The jurisprudence hasn't caught up with the information that we've had. And that was my point.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but our judiciary is corrupt as well, and you see that being changed out right now. So you can't try these cases with corrupt judiciary, and so exposing them is part of the process. I understand what you're saying. It doesn't lessen my desire to get this information out. But I certainly understand your point. Illini, go ahead.
To respond to some of the comments about secret societies here, I think one thing to just be aware of is if everybody remembers Kevin Shipp's book, the outer ring of a secret organization is going to basically look almost exactly to those members like that organization looks like to the rest of the world. Most people are probably going to go through the CIA. Most people are probably going to go through the Skull and Bones Society and the Masons and all these other organizations, and it's going to look to them like it did when they were outside of it. It's going to look relatively innocuous. That said, what Kevin Shipp also kind of illuminates is it's also a really good organization for hiding, a conspiracy. And it doesn't necessarily mean that every single member is going to be aware of it. In fact, the way that these things normally work is most of them don't. But it's kind of an extra hedge of protection around the whole thing, and it makes it a little bit easier, if you need to put something together, to do it through a couple of people in there.
So the only thing that I would push back a little bit on is the use of specifically Skull and Bones. We have come across a couple that doesn't seem to have bought into the destructive narrative or participated in, but the preponderance of their members did. And they were part of, they were in critical places at critical times that illustrate they were definitely part of this international syndicate. The bureaucracies is a better illustration of that. Because if you're picking 15 people out of a junior class at Yale to be a part of an organization that has some really strange ritualistic practices and humiliation that turns into blackmailable information, that's completely different than joining the CIA as Kevin Shipp did and operating in an arena where, and again, they segregate. Okay, I got to run. I just got my departure notification. But if you're the compartmentalization of information in bureaucracies is key to their being able to hide. So in the example of the CIA, where you have analysts and you have operators, the analysts are operating in a vacuum compared to the operators. The operators give them what they tell them is intelligence, and then they analyze that intelligence and spit out a product. But if the input is shit, then the output is shit. And the operators use the information that they put into the analysts, which is crap, and they put the crap output to say whatever they want it to say so they can go do whatever they want to do. And that's how this compartmentalization works in these organizations. It's the same way with the special forces and them going down and training basically death squad leaders in Latin America. They were never told those people were death squad leaders. They had no clue. They relied on CIA information that the people they were training was the freedom fighters. But all of that information was bullshit. And so it is very easy in a bureaucracy to be able to hide the corrupt, crazy people that we talk about every day, that we expose in this bureaucracy because of the built-in classification and stovepipe of information. It is less easier to do that in secret societies because these people meet throughout. They have annual get-togethers and all that other stuff. And it's very hard in these secret societies for one who happens to be working down the hall from another on an operation behind the scenes for them to have any plausible deniability. But I'm living proof that you can be in a system like the US military and not know any of this other crap is going on around you because of the stovepipe classification, read in ability to hide things. So hopefully that makes sense. But I appreciate the fact that not everybody in every one of these organizations, because we found some that were in Skull and Bones that doesn't appear to have participated in any way in their shenanigans. The preponderance did, though. So guys, I've got to run to make our dinner appointment. So I appreciate you being here. We will be back tomorrow as always. And I will be on the Alpha Warrior Show tonight. Take care. All right, got to run.